So I'm Jeff Jarvis. I wrote a book called What Would Google Do? I blog at buzzmachine.com, and I teach journalism. To my right is Nick Denton, a longtime friend who founded Gawker Media. And to my left is Jason Calacanis, almost as longtime a friend, who founded Silicon Valley Reporter, then Weblogs Inc., which is really... We do. I normally bring around accompaniment, you know.
It's my theme music.
It's when you see me, think that way. Just think of the music. So Jason founded Weblogs Inc. and then went on to found Mahalo, a human-powered search engine. But the real reason I think these two are here is because they go back, and I happened to moderate a session with them in 2005 when they were at each other's throats, competing at the start of Weblogs. They were competing heartily, and I think it improved Weblogs as a result. So that was...
And Gawker.
No, I mean the whole thing. The Weblogs,
Weblogs is a
small
general
W,
okay,
yes.
okay.
As a business, it proved as a business, yes. But it improved Gawker. Nick said that yesterday, in fact. So that's where they come from as a history. They're, unfortunately for you, all very friendly now and not as contentious and angry, but we'll see what comes out of them. So why don't we actually start with yesterday? There was a session, we were all part of the, what is it called? The collapse of media? No, the media crack-up. So yesterday afternoon and last night, there was a session with various luminaries trying to grasp for a future business model for media. What did you think of the thinking so far?
This is my first time at the Ideas Festival, and I understand at least that it's a polite affair. One isn't supposed to speak ill of other panels. I was surprised that it was pretty much the same kind of panel, the same kind of conversation that one would have heard in 1999. Maybe a little bit of the air of desperation now is a little more intense, but the same discussions about, is the model for news and online content, is it subscription or is it free, ad-supported? Is it some mixture of the two? Is it going to be micropayments, or is it going to be monthly subscriptions? And I was kind of cast back 10 years. I was trying to work out what is new about the conversation here on the stage with Stephen Brill and Catherine Wayne.
It might have even been a conversation that could have occurred in 95, 96. And if you look at the media industry, they went from being arrogantly dismissive of the internet in the 94, 95, 96, 97 time frame. Nobody will ever use it. Nobody will ever trust it. We're going to do deals with cable companies on the information superhighway. People are going to pay by the minute to read stuff. I mean, there was even this idea of hourly payments because at the time people were paying over $5 an hour for AOL or CompuServe. And then it went to this sort of, well, we're on the web and we've got some people using it and we're making a little bit of money in the 99 period. Maybe it's an opportunity. So they went from dismissive to maybe it's an opportunity to now, because of 10, 15 years of poor execution, being terrified. And when people are scared, they take sort of two forms, and they seem like they are actually, some of them are defiant, like we're going to go down with the ship, which is very noble, I understand, but also stupid because you're going to die. They're going to go down with the ship, and we're seeing it happen as newspapers close. And then there are some who just are frozen. They're literally frozen, some of these people in the media business. They know it's over. They know the Titanic's sinking. They see the life rafts, and they're just like looking. They don't do anything, And
even people who are open-minded, like Catherine Weymouth, I thought was, I don't know, were you all there?
Publisher of the Washington Post.
Yeah.
She was on two panels yesterday. I thought she was very, very smart, kind of savvy, sensible, and she described herself as being open-minded. She was open-minded towards Stephen Brill's idea of putting all newspapers together behind some paywall and charging for access to them all entirely.
He would argue, by the way, that he doesn't suggest putting all their content behind a wall, but 10% of their content and 10% of the people who pay, and he has predictions of the wealth that will cause.
The idea of being open-minded now, or the idea of, and I know you've actually recommended yourself, that newspapers experiment, that they try everything. It's too late. It's 2009. The time for experimentation was about a decade ago.
Yeah.
I think it's reasonably clear what newspapers should do or what they can do.
So what is
right
that?
now.
What should they do?
I think they have to cut down on their political coverage. I think they have to kind of hive off and create brands around the areas of content that actually attract readers and attract advertisers. Like, for instance, Sunday Styles, the New York Times Sunday section. Very popular, highly female audience, desirable for advertisers. That could very easily be an online brand and support itself entirely through online advertising. They don't do it. They're still wedded to the idea of the package, the entire newspaper, with all these topics covered, and at the very, very center of it, national and local political coverage, for which there is no ad-supported model.
And if you look at what the internet is good at, it speeds things up, and it lets you go deeper. So you can have, all of the possible information about cars or hybrid cars that you want, or sports cars, and you can just revel in your niche. And if you look at what newspapers did, they were designed to give people a broad view, an inch deep, of everything going on in the world, which is very noble, and it served a great purpose, but is unnecessary now to give people such a shallow look at the world. And if you look at autos as an example, the New York Times has an auto section. They do two stories every week. If you look at the blogs we created about cars, Autoblog and Jalopnik, which are two of the largest car sites on the web, millions of people go to them a month, they cover 20 to 40 stories per day. And in each of those stories, there are 5 to 150 comments. If you're a car enthusiast, by the time the Sunday New York Times comes around and there's 2 stories about 2 cars that are 600 words each, you know everything that's there already. There are no surprises. And that's what's happening, is people are looking at the newspaper. And how many times have you had this experience? You get the newspaper in the morning, and you look at the front page, and you go, I saw that on Drudge. I saw that on the New York Times website last night. I saw this one in an email from my friend. I got this one in an email alert. This person Twittered this. I saw this on this person's. I sometimes go through it, and I try to find something I don't already know.
Well, you're really talking about the means of production and distribution. The printing press, since Gutenberg, 570 years, dictated what publishing was going to look like. You could do it once a day or once a week, and thus you were going to have to package the world, and they value the package that they make, and it was going to have to be limited. It was going to be one size fits all. It was going to have to be shallow. Right. Those assumptions come out of the necessity of paper. If you take away the necessity of paper, it necessarily changes how you do the job of journalism.
And it's not how people consume news now. People consume news now in a live CNN-like experience. They want, you hear somebody said Michael Jackson died, and then you just keep getting little nuggets of information throughout your day. And they not only have they not changed the distribution, not only have they not experimented with the online, they're still taking the method of doing the journalism that they did in print and doing it online, which is wildly boring and ineffective when you have these little scrappy startups, sending out lots and lots and lots of little pieces of information and letting people debate them.
I think the real question is now not what newspapers should be doing. I think the answers for that are, is there some chatter in the back? It's kind of annoying. It's how institutionally newspapers can force through the change. I think it's reasonably obvious that there are maybe there's a few sections of coverage that could be supported by subscriptions. Most of there are a few areas, women, gadgets, cars, all those special sections of newspapers. That actually newspapers for a long time did quite a good job of. The papers were expanding. What was the New York Times? Circuits. Yeah. Now, why wasn't Circuits the New York Times computer technology section? Why did that never become a brand? Why did they let you with Engadget and us with the Gizmodo?
Eat their lunch.
Yeah. I don't understand why they did that. And so the question is, how institutionally can you make people aware of that?
Or can you? Is it possible for the institutions that we're talking about, put New York Times aside, it's the grand exception to all rules, and even put the Washington Post aside because and the Wall Street Journal because they're national papers in some way. But if you're the Boston Globe, losing $85 million a year, $85 million a year, it's got to bring down the Times. What do you do with the Boston Globe?
You know, I really have to put my hands up, and I have no idea. I don't really know local newspapers in this country. I mean, the only ones I really look at, the only ones that seem to have a chance, frankly, are newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post that have some franchise. The Washington Post could be, if it hadn't let Politico come in and grab and eat its lunch, Washington Post could be the dominant online.
Could be America's Washington Bureau.
Yeah.
Yeah. What would you do? You live in LA.
Yeah.
What do you do with the LA Times?
Well, interestingly, I got asked to be the president of digital for the LA Times when somebody was trying to buy it, and I didn't take the job, but they asked me what I would do, and I said, I think we should cancel the print edition except on Sundays and the weekends. On the weekends, we should make it, we should take all the editorial investment, really put a large amount of it into that weekend edition that has really deep stories that people could sort of curl up with, and keep that newspaper as a keepsake, almost like you wouldn't want to throw it away because it's so valuable, almost like a magazine where you say, you know what, there's just too much great information here for me to throw it away. Then,
is the staff of the LA Times capable of producing that kind of paper?
yeah, I think absolutely. They're basically doing some of that already. What happens when you have this printing press and this daily deadlines and stuff like that is you're spending all your time managing the machine of the printing and the distribution and stuff like that. Just for the CEO and the management team, all their focus is getting pulled on that, and they can't focus on the real opportunities, which is the niche market online and maybe some really considered stuff. And they have to have a radically smaller footprint. And it's very hard for people in life to go backwards, I found, and be nimble. And if you look at companies, and you see this throughout history, IBM was a credible business selling computers and hardware, and they were able to adapt and move into a services company and let other people fight out that low-margin business. I don't think the newspaper industry is largely capable of making this change. I think it's the local news business. Almost all of those newspapers will shut down and be online editions only or weeklies at best.
Go ahead.
I have one idea. For a long time, actually, I had no idea about how a newspaper could. I used to work at the Financial Times, and it's a relatively progressive newspaper. But to push change through an organization like that, which is wedded, which has these great traditions that it adheres to, is very, very difficult. With one idea, everyone says, oh, you have to pay attention to your readers. You have to be reader-centric, which is kind of a fine thing to say, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't allow you to prescribe any particular course of action. I think if newspapers did two things, they put page view numbers next to every single article.
Which you do on your blog posts.
Which we do on our blog posts. A measure of the popularity of every single thing that's written. Nothing more than that. And secondly, if they opened up the newspaper to reader comments, so that they can be moderated, but basically every single article should have, at the end of it, a discussion involving the readers, maybe the source of the story, maybe the reporter, something to expose what the readers think about a particular piece. I'll tell you what would happen. For something like the New York Times, the newspaper which I read, within about 6 months, they would have to give up on a lot of the Albany coverage, for instance, the local political coverage. Because actually there's a very small class of people, mainly the political class, the bureaucratic class, that actually cares about those stories. They would realize that Sunday Styles was probably one of the most important franchises. All the things that they kind of ought to know anyway would become undeniable.
They have all that data now.
But by exposing it in public, it becomes impossible to ignore. The readers see it, the writers see it. The readers complain less if you cut certain areas of coverage because you point and you say, well, look, you see that was 1,000 views compared with 1 million views for the story that we did about the Somali pirates.
The standard argument about that is that it will become not the New York Times, but the Paris Hilton Times.
That's probably true.
Yeah, so you have to moderate that. I mean, I think it's a very good idea. This is an anecdote. I was watching, I woke up on the Saturday where the poor woman was killed in Iran, Neda, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And I just happened to be on Twitter, and I saw Iranian election. I clicked it, and then I was reading the links, and somebody said, oh my God, this woman's been shot. And there's a YouTube video, and I was like, oh my God, I have to click that and see what the hell's going on. And I saw it, and I was like, oh my God, that is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. And it only had like 300 views at that point. So now I'm like, I just jumped down that rabbit hole, like many of you probably do, and started getting obsessed about what's going on there, and which is the wonderful thing about the internet, the ability to get OCD on something. And it is. I mean, we think about how extraordinary it is that we can just learn everything about a subject so quickly and get up to speed. And the New York Times, somehow I stumbled on it, maybe somebody Twittered it or it was on a blog, was doing a live blog coverage of what was coming out of Iran. It was brilliant. It was the best thing online. So then I went and I had a cup of coffee and I came back and I tried to find it. I went to the New York Times. I couldn't find it. And they had it buried like 7 levels deep.
Newspaper or online?
Online. There was somebody at the New York Times or at home in their underwear putting updates every 15 minutes about what was going on in Iran, writing it with 2 or 3 links to the source material. There's a tweet here that says there's a thing here, there's a video here. And it was like, why is this not the homepage right now? And it's like, there are smart people at the New York Times, I know many of them, but there is institutional sloth and greed and just fatness, and they can't move quick.
That is the tragedy of these newspapers have brilliant people, and actually even more importantly, they have brilliant readers. I remember there was an article, it was actually about blogging, and it was the Emily Gould front cover of the New York Times magazine about how too much blogging, too much oversharing, too much exposure of your own life could not be worth it. And they opened up that particular article to comments. And for the first time ever, I was actually terrified by the New York Times as a competitor, because you read through these comments, and they were smart. The grammar was perfect. The spelling. I mean, you should see the comments on our sites. I mean, we have probably better than average internet sites and readership. So certainly our readers are very smart about gadgets or cars, but not all of them can write. And to see...
That doesn't stop them, though.
Either as individuals.
Doesn't deter them.
No.
but why couldn't the New York Times, if the New York Times could actually capture the intelligence, both of their writers and these people who are doing the great Twitter live blogs, and their incredibly smart readers, they would be an incredibly
I've argued this when I've met people from the New York Times and The Economist and the FT and The Guardian, where I write, and they have the argument is you have an incredibly wise crowd, and the challenge is to bring that out in this new age. When I talk to companies about what their value is, they always are very inwardly focused, whether it's media or any other company. We have our brand, our content, our reputation, our this, our that. They hardly ever say they're public. Now, I'm violating this rule right now, and I'll stop it in a minute, but we're in a smart crowd. It could be a larger crowd, but we're in a smart crowd. And so what are we doing up here just talking ourselves? That's true of companies, too. If companies can find ways to capture the wisdom of their crowd, not in purely democratic ways, not in voting about everything, but just in qualitative ways, they're missing that intelligence.
I tried to, when we were doing Weblogs Inc., and we had 500 bloggers at the peak working for us before we sold the company, I tried to hire journalists, because I was a former journalist and editor of my own print magazine, and every time I ran into the same kind of problems, specifically with the audience, which was they had no interest in interacting with the audience. They did not want to hear from the audience. They did not want to mix it up with the audience. In fact, they didn't like the idea that comments were allowed. They wanted to moderate the comments because they didn't, if somebody were to say, like, you made a mistake, they would like to catch that before it got posted, fix it. And this is where I think journalism got a little bit off the rails, and a little bit, the media companies got very fat and full of themselves, and a little high on their own supply, as Scarface would say. They which is the number one rule, you just don't do that. They actually thought that they were very important people, and that they start to think that they're like the subjects they're covering. And when you're a journalist and you start to think like you're like the big CEOs or whoever important people you're covering, you sort of lose something. And they couldn't handle the pressure of the public audience interacting with them. Now, so that led us to the belief that we should look in the comments and hire the great commenters. And some of the best writers we ever found were people who would write a comment that was twice as long as the blog post with 3 really insightful things when the blog post itself had no insightful things. And that created this nice creative tension with the existing bloggers and the commenters that, we're equal in some ways. Yes, I'm writing the post, but you're an intelligent person. We respect you, and we respect your knowledge. You might, in fact, know something more than us. And I don't know if anybody here has been quoted in the New York Times here before. Has anybody been quoted in the New York Times? Okay. Has anybody who's been quoted in the New York Times maybe felt that their quote wasn't perfectly accurate as to what they said? Yeah, exactly. We've all been manipulated that way and had, the writer ask you 7 questions in a row to try to get you to say it a certain way, and it's insulting. And now that whole, sort of process has been flipped over. And frankly, I think they deserve to die, a lot of them. I mean, and I don't cry for them at all. I think that they made their bed, and creative destruction is good. I think there's going to be a whole group of new news sources that are going to be better. And they're going to be faster, they're going to be more accurate, and they're going to deliver a quality of news that I think is less pretentious and treats the audience with a little more respect.
Actually, we should probably pass that more accurate, because let's face it, blogs are actually individually extremely inaccurate. We get stories wrong the whole damn time. If I was going to be going back to your example of what it's like to be interviewed by the New York Times, the New York Times is never going to totally screw you over. The New York Times will always be relatively fair. Even if the writer is inclined against you, the editor will stop it becoming a hit piece. The New York Times doesn't really do hit pieces. On a blog, there's actually there's no one to call, there's no one to complain to, there's no ombudsman or anything like that. I think the key point is that in aggregate, the blogs get it right. Eventually they get it right. They may stumble upon it. And I think the great parallel here is actually the British press, which is actually very much more like blogs, versus the American press in the coverage of where were the weapons of mass destruction after the invasion of Iraq. And I think the lag between the British press really kind of getting hold of that story and the American press doing it was somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And the British press got a lot of the stories, got a lot of the individual stories wrong. They relied on one source inside the government, on leaks, misdirection. Yeah. But in aggregate, eventually they got it right. And I think that's the future of blog-style journalism, is that it'll be messy and
it's the process
getting made.
Journalism is not a product. We thought journalism was a product because we printed it once a day. It had to be a product. It had to be perfect. That was a myth. It's a process, and the process is necessarily messy. It's always been messy. We just tried to hide the mess from you.
It's like an open kitchen versus a closed kitchen. Some old restaurants used to go to a nice French restaurant. This beautiful plate came out, and if you went in the kitchen, you'd be disgusted. Oh my God, it's a mess. And then some chef was like, what we do back here is beautiful. It's not perfect. I may drop something, but you're going to get to watch me cook your food. I like watching them cook my food. I think that's kind of cool. And I think if you're an intelligent reader, would anybody here like to have, when Woodward and Bernstein were doing their thing, would you like to have listened in on some of those conversations and had them put it out in little pieces? Things like Watergate would have, if it was occurring during a blog era, would have come out much quicker, because there would have been so many leaks all along. And then I'm a big boy. I can read something and say, okay, this was a leak. The blogger says, we got this through a tip line. And okay, buyer beware. It's probably false, but it could be true. I'm a big boy. I can handle it. Give me all the news and help me sort through it. That's a better process than this, we're going to collect it all for a couple of weeks, and then we're going to let some out, Well,
and also, let's face it, the newspapers, when they call up an official for comment, the officials lie the whole damn time. And if you're dependent on getting the on-the-record comment from the official, you're not going to be able to print the truth, because they're not going to give you the truth. You're going to rely on, you need to be able to rely on the unofficial sources, or maybe you actually need to rely on some crazy blogger who's going to print it anyway, even without the official confirmation, and then force the official or the company into making a denial or confirming some element of the story. And so that process, maybe at the end of the day, you need somebody like the New York Times or its online equivalent to put the stamp of, this is the 100% confirmed truth.
Well, for now, for today, it may change tomorrow. It's still processed even in the New York Times.
But we need the people who are going to take the crazy risks with the stories.
I quote you as finding what we call half-baked posts and blogs, which Nick years ago he often forgets things he tells me. Then I quote him anyway, but I'll quote him anyway, saying that this is what we know, this is what we don't know. What do you know? And by putting up a story unfinished, it's like Google putting out a beta. It says, this isn't done yet, help us finish this. And journalists have to become as good at saying what they don't know as they are at saying what they know. So even the New York Times, the fact that blog came out of the New York Times is an important cultural move for them. Yeah. Because, I'm sorry.
So one of the questions that I think is behind a lot of what you're saying, I want to try and see if I can link it a bit, is you have this tension because there is the traditional, traditional media
or the model of the traditional media was that you had credibility and gravitas and you know where to find it, right? And I think we've all seen a talent drain in the traditional media's quality over the last few years too, right? To your points about the types of
So at the same time,
we have the deep but unverified assertions of the bloggers, right? So we have there's this bridge that's missing between how do I recreate in my online media the same credibility, and one of the things you're saying is does popularity do it? Again, like Technorati was trying to to basically measure gravitas, and that's had its limitations. But then you have to inject on that the absence of a business model, right? That online generates that, how do you get the robust business model that gives you the
models. It may not be enough to support the 1,200 people in the New York Times newsroom because the structure is different. The papers aren't monopolies anymore.
We have 100 journalists. That's...
We had 500 freelancers. I would say if you put them into full-time positions, it'd be 100, 150, yeah, something like that.
They're eating. Yeah, and we're hiring right now, and the unit you sold to AOL is profitable with an AOL, I'm assuming.
Very profitable, yeah.
We're profitable. There is a model.
It may not establish, but it goes to your point, it may not maintain that kind of packaging that that the industry and we were used to for hundreds of years. There's going to be chaos. Clay Shirky wrote a brilliant essay. Google it. Shirky spelled S-H-A-R-K-Y, no E. And the word unthinkable, thinking the unthinkable is the name. Google that. I recommend it highly. And he goes back to Gutenberg and looks at the disruption that caused. And we are now in a similar disruption now. We will end up with something. We are hopeful, because we've been doing stuff, we'll end up with something good, but it is definitely going to be different. And our assumptions can't necessarily rise the same way. I met with the New York Public Librarians because of my book. And by the way, I'm a hypocrite for putting out a book. I should have put it out online, but they paid me. And they realized that, I asked the question to them, what if you shut down the building? What are you? And the same thing you should ask the newspaper. Shut down the press. What are you? You're not paper. That's the death of them, is they think they're paper. So a library, they realized that besides being a repository for books, well, the internet can be the repository now through Google. But they still have value. And their value is both knowledge, but it's a knowledge of how to do things, and it's also a knowledge of how to connect people. It's also a smart crowd of people who know things. So if you reinvented Alexandria today, you'd probably call it Google.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the New York Public Library and you see all those computers in the waiting line for people to get in there and do homework and research, and they're not allowed to do video games there and stuff like that. And it's, obviously the library has a lot of purpose. Maybe not to store books anymore. Like maybe you don't need to have the stacks as much because people can have that instant access anywhere. So it's a huge opportunity.
I worked at the New York Public Library for 8 years as the Vice President for Development. And I think what's missing here is the absolute joy of seeing the primary resource material. And we're talking about collections that are far beyond books, particularly in the New York Public Library. And there are special collections in libraries throughout the world, but in the United States we have really, really valuable resources that are not translated through digitization. I don't care what anybody says. I've worked in museums. You cannot capture the beauty of a work of art on the internet. I mean, you can enjoy the visual image, but the aesthetic experience of being in front of
Mona Lisa in a book.
Right, exactly. But the point
But
is you can
that doesn't
have an
mean the book's
opportunity.
bad.
No, but you can have the opportunity to see actual manuscripts, actual books that have value beyond the content, the actual aesthetics of touching the book. I mean, when we would pull out the Japanese scrolls at the New York Public Library for potential donors, it was magic. It was just magic. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the information that you want about those Japanese scrolls can't be accessed via the internet.
People should have access to both, I don't think anybody on this panel is anti-library museum.
The question of the aesthetic appeal is the same argument that people made for paper print newspapers. That, but my
Yeah.
my iPhone won't have.
Or scribes who beautifully decorated the page, and Gutenberg ruined all that. Darn him.
Hi, I admit, first of all, to having Gutenberg mentality, but I'm very interested in the legal aspects of print versus you guys. And you have no incubation period, so you can come out instantly. But press has to really sit back and say, well, when am I going to be sued? You don't seem to enjoy lawsuits. I don't see any. Yes. But you're not bothered by the legality of lawsuits, are you?
I think the difference is that it's newspapers, it's permanent. So once it's written, it's committed. Anything that's actually published online can be changed and can be updated, and that changes the circumstances somewhat.
And if there's disclosure and somebody says, we've got, this leaked memo and in our anonymous email box from a Yahoo email address, take it for what it's worth, here it is. As the audience knows, this is an anonymous tip, and they can judge it as such. And that means you're not going to really get sued. But that being said, we got takedown letters all the time for different things that were leaked to us. Everything from schematics for an iPhone or a BlackBerry that were leaked to our, journalists at the, and bloggers are sort of a subsection.
Maybe part of your success is that you're free of lawyers.
We're not free of lawyers. In fact, our head of operations is a lawyer and spends at least half of her time dealing with letters from people who are threatening to sue us. But let's take an example. This is kind of a positive example. The Church of Scientology, a very fearsome organization, that had actually intimidated most newspapers. I think St. Petersburg Times ran some pieces and got sued pretty badly by them. They pretty much scared off mainstream journalists. We ran a video of Tom Cruise, a secret internal cult video of him marketing the religion. We got the usual Scientology letters, cease and desists, threats to sue. We're not necessarily brave, but the internet collectively, the competitive pressures to get something out, even if there is a legal risk, and if you're not going to do it, then somebody else is going to do it. That collectively, the internet is a more formidable foe to people like the Church of Scientology who want to keep information quiet, than the newspapers were.
And we have to have a different, I think the law has to update too. Just as industries have to update, so must the law. It always must, right? And well, you have to pay attention not to the mistake made, but about what you do to it, what you do about it. I learned the ethic of corrections on blogs is you don't erase the error. You have to cross out the error. You have to show that it was there. Someone comes along and sees later, oh yeah, he did say that. But now it's corrected.
But in the St. Petersburg Times case, the Church of Scientology spent $37 to file that lawsuit. It has cost them their livelihood.
The harassment factor is there, yes.
Yeah.
But now they've given up. In the last year or
they
two,
can't win anymore.
But, and if they knock one internet site down, then another internet site pops up with the same information. No, not personally. It would have been somebody else.
The medium.
Yeah.
Yesterday there was a conversation. If any of you went to the content. Did anyone go to that yesterday? It was Content of the Future, and Priscilla Payton was the speaker, and she was talking about books. And your comment about the library, I mean, I love the internet and all the news, but there's this just balance of, liking the book and looking it up and reading. And it was interesting where they were talking about with the Kindle, the Kindle, how you can order books and sections or chapters or short stories, and embedded would be John F. Kennedy's speech, like real, so the whole thing is so ready to change. The news and...
It's a great opportunity, yes.
The bulk of your initial discussion had to do with blogs versus newspapers, but where do magazines or Sunday sections of newspapers like the Week in Review section of the New York Times or say, an article in Newsweek magazine about biological anthropology, or people who really want to find out about something but don't have either the inclination of the time or the aesthetic to sit down in front of a computer screen, as opposed to having something where you can turn back. And I mean,
he was the founding editor of Entertainment Weekly. So
Nick and I were talking about this earlier. Nick's goal in life at one point was to be the Cy Newhouse of blogs. Is that still the case?
I'm not sure whether that's a role model.
If I started EW today, it wouldn't be a magazine, because it loses all that value of all the people out there who are watching movies, and it takes away this one-size-fits-all notion. It would be Rotten Tomatoes, and it would be other things like that. Notice also the Condé Nast portfolio folded recently after a reported investment of $120 million. EW took an investment of $200 million, not all my fault, before it broke even. My theory is that magazines will come back with the economy to some measure of health, but we're never going to see that level of investment again. And so what dies is magazine launches. So hug the ones you have, because I don't think there are going to be many new ones coming down the pike.
And if we're going to talk about long-form journalism, there's long-form journalism actually in a physical magazine, but there actually probably is a future for a long-form journalism online, certainly as readers get better and the screen definition of iPhones improves. And one of the things that we found is that when we started, and probably Jason would confirm this, that there was a shortage of pointers to good information online, and so we provided pointers. Blogs were basically short paragraphs with a joke or a bit of attitude and a link pointing usually to a newspaper article. And one of the things that we've discovered over the last few years is that the returns, and this is not a moral imperative for us, but the return to producing original and sometimes even long-form journalism, the return has improved, because now there's 1 million Twitter accounts, and there are all these blogs, and there's Dig, and there are all these people linking, all these people desperately looking for anything original online. And so whereas before an original piece might have gotten 10 times the page views, 10 times the audience of a throwaway one paragraph joke and a link, now probably the ratio is more like 100 to 1. And so the market is sort of starting to correct itself, and and anyone who's actually bemoaning the fate of long-form journalism should be reassured by that.
Yeah, and also, people have ADD, and it's part of our culture to sort of move from things very quickly. But after consuming information that way for a while, I think that people start to desire something longer and some wisdom, and it's just a natural sort of, if you've been watching short things for a long time, to want to watch something long form. And so people get easily distracted online, but there is some long form journalism, long form stories will be fine. Magazines, I had a magazine, I sold it, and it's that's a horrible business to be in. I mean, if you think about news, the news function of a magazine, I mean, we're talking about the news function of a daily newspaper being taken away from them. Forget about a magazine. I mean, magazines just 10, 15 years ago used to be able to break news. They would be like, oh my God, there's a story is coming out in Vanity Fair that is unbelievable. It's going to be on the news. And people used to cover magazine news stories on news, on TV or whatever. And that doesn't happen anymore. It's just impossible to keep a story that you're working on for 3 months under wraps. It's going to leak on the blogs.
Can you address a bit more about some of the new innovations in blogging, like Tumblr, which is a really cool tool, really neat way to do an easy blog, or also, as you just mentioned, Delicious and Dig, and these sharing sites that are really exploding?
Twitter is the biggest innovation, because Twitter is really just short form blogging, and ironically, I think Twitter is probably better news for newspapers than it is for blogs. If you think about it, you've got newspapers. The average article length is maybe let's say 800 words. Blogs, the average item length is 200 words, and Twitter, the average length is probably 10 words. And 10 words goes better with 800 words than it goes with 200 words, because if you look at a Twitter feed and you click on a link, and you go through to a short blog post, you kind of feel cheated, let's be honest. Whereas if it's a newspaper article, 20 words seems like a kind of pretty good introduction to 800 words. So I think actually the latest innovation in blogging is bad news for the early blogs and good news for those ancient newspapers that now have another way to pitch their stories.
You know, I think a large portion of the traffic referred to newspapers will be Twitter. Maybe it won't be Google level, but it could be for a niche publication. If they cover something about, you know, something going on in Aspen, some controversy, and 10 people from Aspen tweeted, well, and they each have 50 followers, it's 500 people, and it would follow that people who are from Aspen and have homes here have other Twitter followers. It's going to spread very quickly if it's newsworthy. And so it's pretty radical change. It's accelerated the virality of stories. The word of mouth, it just instantly spreads.
It also makes it all more social. This notion of following is so much more important than the length or even the medium, that it becomes a means of choosing where to go. Add search to that, and you have the trends, and you have a whole new layer of news.
They said, like, this is good enough for me to take the time to share it with you. It would be like you telling somebody about a TV show. You're sort of validating it, and so it means the chance of somebody clicking it or interacting with it go way up.
It's also no surprise that Twitter is quite so popular among people you'd have thought of as being dinosaurs. That, you know, there are newspaper journalists who never really got into any former phase of technology, and they take to Twitter like you know, very, very enthusiastically. I think partly because they like to broadcast, and Twitter is kind of a broadcast model. Whereas Facebook, if you're writing something on Facebook, you're writing for your friends. They're equal. On Twitter, there are no equals on Twitter. Jason has, how many followers do you have now? And how many people do you follow? 300, 400. So it's asymmetric, which actually works quite well if you're a newspaper person and you're used to lecturing people, and you don't particularly want to listen too much.
There's somewhat preaching to the converted, obviously, but there's a lot of concern about investigative journalism sort of disappearing or not being funded or whatever. But it seems to me, just on that point, that Twitter, given the Ron experience and so forth, ironically, somebody whom we see here and appreciate a lot, Tom Friedman said the other day, he's kind of let his Twitter account languish, but many others have not, obviously, because, as Margaret Carlson said yesterday, we were all Iranians for a week or so. To what extent and how ironic is it that something that is as brief and short snippets as Twitter and can also lead to those articles may make up that difference for the funded investigative journalism, which I have always thought was kind of underfunded and overhyped for what it is. Never had enough funding anyway by the newspapers. Are we able to make up for that with Twitter, with people tweeting and so forth?
Actually, I think the blogs will do a better job of investigative journalism than Twitter. That the journalists, whether they're on blogs or whether they're in newspapers, will use Twitter as a source of ideas.
Distribution and input.
But I think the impact of Twitter, though, is also that by providing all that attitude and those quick links, they kind of force everybody else to up their game. So that it's not enough for us just to do quick blog posts. We actually have to do original stories that will get linked by Twitter. We're being kind of pushed into doing good despite all our best intentions.
I am feeling older and older the longer I sit in this class. Oh, how does Twitter make money? And who owns Twitter?
It doesn't.
Yeah.
It was created, though, by the guy, one of the co-founders is Evan Williams, who created Blogger, and blogs changed the world. So I would underestimate Evan and company at one's peril. It has investors, including Fred Wilson, who's a top investor. They're looking for the business model. But you know what? Google, when it started, had no business model. It's an ad company. They didn't know that at the beginning. Skype, when it started, was giving away everything and got bought for a large amount of money. They would rent it by eBay. You could go through all these networks. In a network economy, you grow to that size, you will find benefit, I think.
They'll make money from advertising. Text ads. So you'll do a search on Twitter, And you do a search for Starbucks or Aspen, and there'll be a little ad that says, oh, come to Matsuhisa, $100 omakase. And you click that, and they'll pay 50 cents every time you click, or $1. Or you'll type Aspen rentals into, or Aspen ski conditions into Twitter and see what people are tweeting about the ski conditions here. And there'll be a ski resort with some special there for you to click on.
I, too, don't want to sound like a dinosaur, but what is a Tumblr?
It's blog software. It's a lightweight blog software. Yeah.
It's a really easy way to click quotes.
Hi, I'm Nancy Ryland. What do you say to the argument, why be on these social sites beyond connecting, okay? Following someone, I can barely be uber productive in my own life rather than watching everyone else be productive. And so this argument, my father's asking, he's in his 70s, why would I do that? I can barely get through my day and accomplish what I choose to accomplish. So why would I watch people do it? It's like watching TV all day or something about other people doing great things. Why don't I do something great today? So how do you, and I'm not saying that it's not a good place to get news. That's one thing. But this social networking bit.
It's probably a waste of time. I agree. There's probably better things to do. I concur.
It saves me time. Right? Reporters I know who use it go out and ask their public questions, and the answers come back. It's pretty magical that way. In my book, my readers wrote an entire chapter because I had no ideas, and they said, "No, you're wrong, Jarvis. Here's what's going on," and they wrote the chapter. That's the deal. It's a generous world.
It is. It's great. It's sharing, and I get that. But this bit about following people, what they're doing at the moment, or where they are in the world, or, I find that.
Don't you follow your friends, your family? People you find interesting, don't you follow the New York Times?
I love it, but I don't need to know where,
Then unfollow.
I don't even know where my husband is,
Then unfollow.
You might need to have him start tweeting.
I'm going to change the subject. Even how do you see blogging and the future of education? I'm a teacher at the middle school here. I've started to do some blogs, but I see a lot of potential that I can't really envision.
It's obviously a great way to communicate. I know a lot of schools have blogs, and it's a way to build community and for people to discuss issues around the school. And I think it's probably a great way for students to learn how to communicate. I mean, writing blog posts, you have to be, pretty succinct. But I don't know if they're necessarily the best tools for education. There might be other tools that are better, to be honest.
Yeah, sort of follow-up comments, and I know you're not dealing with this, but I'm just wondering if you know any good sort of psychological studies on the impact of all of this, because recently I spent way too many hours in the Denver airport, and a young mother was there with a maybe 3 or 4-year-old, and I was there for 4 hours, and she was on her BlackBerry the entire time, not paying any attention to her child. I'm a professor, and I worry about the lack of direct communication with people. I think it's great to reach out to others, but I also worry about personal interaction, eye-to-eye contact, conversation when in the middle of talking to somebody, suddenly they're on their iPhone, it's like, and suddenly you're not nearly as important as that message coming in from someplace else. And then another issue is, what are we saving time for? What is the purpose of saving so much time? What are you then using that time for in order to get on doing more blogging? I'm just curious.
There is definitely a downside to it. There's actually an excellent movie coming out called We Live in Public that won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance about this very issue. People online can lose a little bit of their humanity, and you have to balance it. Most bloggers, the good ones, suffer from blogger burnout. They get too obsessed, like anything. And there's some people who run too much, and then some people who ski too much, read too many books, and don't socialize enough. So, everything in balance. You might have some terrible disease that you can't relate to anybody because nobody has this particular disease you have. But you go online and you meet 20 people instantly who have that, and you can immediately start talking to them. And that's an incredible advantage to the online world, is that you can go meet people and socialize with them, and that's very powerful. But you are correct that there is no substitute for real-world communication. And I think we're evolving as a species to include this new layer of communication, this new layer of interacting. But if people told you 100 years ago we would be watching 50 hours of TV a week or whatever it is that the average American watches, you would think that's incredibly, science fiction and not possible.
I think we will learn eventually how to deal with these technologies, but we certainly haven't yet. And one of the phenomena, I think the lack of attention that people pay to people they're actually speaking to at the time is definitely an issue. I think the other thing, the other problem is that often writers, even news writers, will realize they will get so much response from anything they expose about themselves that they'll expose more. That it feeds into narcissism. We had a writer, I can say who she is because she actually wrote a big New York Times Magazine piece about this whole phenomenon. A writer called Emily Gould. And she used to complain that she had writer's block. She was a very good writer, but a pretty infrequently published writer. She started writing for us. She started writing news, but then also talking about her relationship with this guy called Joshua, who was also a writer on the site. And then he would write about his relationship with her, and pretty rapidly the whole thing got out of control. She exposed more than I think she actually wanted to. It was kind of addicting, because she would get, the more she would expose, the more response she would get, emails, comments. But I don't think people have learned to dial that down. They haven't actually learned the price yet of that kind of exposure.
And certainly young people don't think about the price of exposure like that. They just think, oh my God, I'm drunk and you just took your clothes off. I'm going to take a picture of that and put it on my Facebook. And then they get older and somebody Googles their name because they're hiring them, and it's like, whoa, hello.
But the other end of this, I think, is that we talk often about privacy as the issue. There's also benefits to publicness. Because I live in public, I found help for a medical condition I have. I got a book contract. I came here. Living in public has its benefits. And I also think we're more social than ever, and I think it's a good thing. Quick quiz. How many of you have searched Google for your high school or college or former boyfriends or girlfriends? A pretty honest crowd. The rest of you aren't, but that's all right. Yeah. And you wish you hadn't. But you think of how you would never have found those people again if not for Google. And think how young people today will be connected with people for the rest of their lives. And they can't run away. They can't hide. Somebody's going after Nick right now. And so I think that these are profound changes in society we're only beginning to figure out. They are what they are. We can resist them. We can do what the newspaper industry has done and try to resist them and hold off the change. The change is coming. So we figure out what to do about it, what cautions to take, where to go. But you see here three optimists about this world, and you have the final word.
In my generation, we were taught, I think, that you only have one reputation. And you all have the ability, through leak or innuendo or whatever, to ruin one's reputation. But you said, oh, well, this was something I got anonymously. But once you say it, it is so hard for a person to ever take that away from themselves. I hope you have a great sense of responsibility.
I wouldn't worry that much about the younger generation whose reputations are being trashed online, because
people can be ruined.
I think that the general public standards have changed too. The whole concept of what ruin means. You can have Paris Hilton who has sex, who has a sex on camera, a sex video which is viewed by tens of, if not hundreds of millions of people, who actually has had no. She said there's been no adverse consequence. I think the key is to. The shame is only the shame that you allow yourself to feel.
The president inhaled. This president inhaled and he got in. And you could say that means it's a lowering of our standards. Or Eric Schmidt said a few years ago that at a personal democracy forum that perhaps we should all, at the age of 21, be able to change our names so we can start over. But the other way I look at it is there's a theory of mutual humiliation, right? Jason's done embarrassing things. I've done embarrassing things. Why go after him? Because then he'll go after mine. Okay, onward.
Going to make us more tolerant people. We'll look around. We'll see that everybody has flaws. Everybody has scandals. Everyone has affairs. Everyone has sex tapes. Everyone does drugs.
And it makes for great blogging.
What part of you I left out? I've missed the drugs and sex at the Aspen Institute.
and none of it really matters. Not if somebody's taken a screenshot of it.
On this note, I think we've hit our time, but thank you very much, and thank you, Nick and Jason.